Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on using the Energy Zones Mapping Tool, EZMT, to plan for clean energy. This webinar is part of the Clean Energy and Energy Management webinar series, and the series is a collaboration between the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, and the University of Michigan, with a goal to help provide local governments across the state with practical advice for taking actions related to clean energy. I'm Sarah Mills, and I'm a researcher at the University of Michigan's Graham Sustainability Institute, where I manage our collaboration with EGLE. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to give you a little bit of a background on how this fits with some of the other resources that we've developed in partnership with EGLE. On the Communities tab of EGLE's website, so if you go to www.michigan.gov/energy, up in this corner, there's the Communities tab. When you go to energy, you can click down and get to communities. You'll see a number of resources that we've developed to help communities in planning and zoning for renewables. So first, there's this curated repository of planning and zoning templates, both specifically for solar as well as for wind. Mostly it focuses on utility scale solar and wind, but there's also some template language to use on zoning, for example, for rooftop solar. There's also a zoning database so that you can search what peer communities in Michigan, how they treat wind and solar in their zoning ordinances. And this Clean Energy in Michigan series includes a bunch of case studies of solar and wind projects, frequently asked questions, small research projects on kind of what the impacts that those projects have had on the communities that host them, that sort of thing. As part of this partnership with EGLE, I've also given presentations to local governments across the state about planning and zoning for clean energy. And we'll have some more presentations on the nuts and bolts of planning and zoning as part of this webinar series in the coming weeks. But one of the first questions that I get in giving those presentations is whether and where within a community it might be possible to site renewable energy. And that's where EZMT comes in. I kind of stumbled upon EZMT by accident. I don't think it's one of its target users is, local government zoning personnel. But I honestly have found it to be the best one-stop shop for understanding what existing energy infrastructure there is in a community, what sort of potential you have for clean energy infrastructure in the future. And what I think is really unique about it is that it's not just from kind of a technical feasibility energy perspective. The tool also overlays some of the land use characteristics that renewable energy developers take into account when scoping out good sites for projects, so that you can better understand what parts of your community may be viable for future energy development. Today's format is a little bit different than what we've done in webinars in the past. So we only have one speaker, Jim Kuiper from Argonne National Lab. Jim gave a short slideshow previously on the origins of the EZMT tool that you can find a link to on EGLE's website. For this webinar, he'll also give a live demo on how that tool works. As you'll see from that demo, I'm going to chime in and ask Jim to show us some of the features of the tool that I think would be most useful to land use planners. And just by way of a short introduction, Jim is a principal geospatial engineer at Argonne National Lab, which is the Department of Energy lab that's based near Chicago. I'll let him fill you in on any of the other important details of his background, and that was also in the previous webinar, but again, wanted to note that he has Michigan roots, having grown up in Ann Arbor and having gotten both his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Michigan. So Jim, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and give you permission to share yours and then let you take it away.
All right, welcome everyone. Yeah, I grew up in Ann Arbor, and I went to Pioneer High School, if any of you know that, and then was in the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources before they added the E and the S. So it's been a while. All right, I'm going to be giving a demonstration, and This is the homepage for the Energy Zones mapping tool. Its URL is ezmt.anl.gov. And there's a few resources on the website. There's a little news area and also a link at the bottom for past news announcements. And those mostly pertain to data updates and other changes to the tool over time. There's a few background sections about the energy resources and how different technologies work that generate power using those resources. And one part I want to draw your attention to is the register link. So the tool itself has a registration. It's not intended to keep anybody from accessing it. It's more, the accounts are a means of you saving your work between sessions. So when you return to the tool, the map layers that you had loaded and the location you zoomed into are preserved. And there's also a set of modeling or report results that you generate over time, and you can manage those in your account. I also want to point out the help menu. Even on the homepage, you can get at the help for the tool. It includes kind of just a text user manual that's not very engaging, but it's there. And then a whole series of, these are short videos. They're about 2 to 3 minutes a piece, and they quickly show you the highlights of how to use different parts of the tool. So we think that'll be pretty effective if you aren't sure how to use something. You can also contact us. There's an email, just ezmt@anl.gov. You can email that and ask for any assistance or questions you have. Okay, well, I've already registered, obviously, and so I'm going to click login, and I've got my material cached here, and then I can launch the tool. So the tool launches in a separate tab or window, depending on your settings, and you need to have your pop-ups enabled for this to work properly, both launching the tool and some of the items within it require your pop-ups to be activated. So if you ever click on something and you don't get any response, maybe check for, usually at the top right of your browser, there's a little message indicating that something was blocked, and you can enable that. It doesn't have ads or anything, so you're not going to be getting, spammed with anything you don't want or didn't ask for if you enable that. Okay, this is a national tool. It originated, as I mentioned in the presentation, with the Eastern Interconnection, which is kind of the power grid, the electrical transmission grid that covers the eastern half of the country, except for parts of Texas, which has its own interconnection. It was primarily focused on energy transmission and generation in its outset. So the data content is very highly focused on energy infrastructure, energy resources, and really quite a large library of citing factors that pertain to whether you could build a power plant or site a transmission line, that sort of thing, in a location. So it gives you a lot of insight about the environment and other characteristics that do come into play. I'm going to be focused on the state of Michigan today. So first thing I'm going to do is zoom in there. And before I do that, I'll just mention a few things about the tool. This panel on the left is table of contents, controls what's displayed on the map. At the bottom, which is sometimes scroll off the screen, there's a toggle for the base map. So these are publicly accessible base maps that are served on the web by others. So we don't control the actual content of the base map, but it's usually very high quality information. And when you have a lot of layers added to the screen, you might even want to turn the base map off. So you can do that here. And then each layer in the table of contents is listed. If you right click on it, it has a few extra controls that you can choose. and you can drag and drop the layers to change the drawing order if you wish. State boundary isn't loaded by default. I just had that previously. The check mark toggles the visibility of the layer, and these two are loaded by default. These are kind of, I'll explain later, but they will display corridors and analysis areas that you have designated in your session. Yeah, so for example, I have an analysis area here and in Saginaw Bay that I've sketched on the map. So I can toggle those on and off as an overlay. At the top here is a set of the main tools in the system, and I'll be working with those throughout the session. And then at the top of the map area, these are map control tools. So right now the zoom in tool is activated, and I just drag a box and it'll zoom. The zoom levels are, because of the base maps only being available at certain scales, there's certain zoom in steps. So if you make a slight adjustment, it might not actually zoom in the map. That'll maybe be a little confusing. There's an information or identify tool that you can click on, and if you click on map features, it opens a dialog for whatever's under your click point. And if there are multiple layers there, it'll have sections. You can control those by toggling these little markers on the right, and it'll have additional database information about those features. The other major tool for map navigation is just to be able to measure things. So, for example, if you wanted to measure an area on the map, you select that tool, single click an area, and when you double click, it finishes and gives you a little display of what you've just measured. So that's useful for quick measurements. Okay. One of the key things you would start with typically is the map library. This catalog has over 300 layers of map content. Each one of these is a separate database. Many of these are available online from their original sources, and we've collected it, and we've tried to vet the best available data sources for a particular topic. So a lot of work has gone into developing this catalog. And we're going to be talking about modeling, just some basics about the modeling capabilities. But I just want you to know there's a catalog here of all the modeling layers also available. So if you toggle that tab, you can display the modeling layers on the map. At the top, you can, if you hover over the top, there's a sort option. There's a filtering option. So for example, if I choose utilities, it'll just show me the layers. Mainly, this is mainly the energy infrastructure layers. And you can clear those tabs by either clearing the filter checkboxes at the bottom, or using that menu again. And then I'm just going to start adding layers to the map. So a quick way, once you're more familiar with the content or have certain things you're looking for, is to filter on the name. So if I type trans for transmission, I can add those. So I click that little icon on the left to add the layer. Now, if I'm curious of where that layer came from, what's the source besides that little short phrase on the right, I can click that PDF icon, and it'll pop up a tab, and this is actually just a PDF file of descriptive information about that layer. And this is usually a multi-page document, and it has all kinds of details about that data. So that's a very useful way to understand what is it you're looking at when you have a particular layer. This other icon is a download link, and almost every layer is downloadable. Those that are not, it's just usually it's either way too large to just download with a click, maybe over a gigabyte of data or something. Or there might be a few limitations to being able to distribute data. But if you look at the metadata, it has the original source where we obtained it. So most of those you can just go to the original source and download it from there. Or worst case, if you're unable to get at something like we got it from internal communication, just email us and we'll assist you. There's a little expansion plus icon on the left. If you open that up, it gives you a little bit more details about the layer. And one of the key things is when it was last updated in the tool and the publication date for the layer, if it's available. Sometimes people don't document that, so there occasionally is missing information there. Okay, let's try some more. Let's get the power plants. Substations. There's an excellent database that's been developed for wind turbines. Actually, two of them. One is existing locations, and the other one is from the, let's see. Oh, well, it's actually the FAA database, but the Fish and Wildlife Service did some work to make it a little bit more easily loaded. So that's the data source there. But whenever you're putting a tower up of any significant size, you need to get it permitted through the FAA. So that's actually a pretty interesting database because it includes permit applications, and that can show where people are investigating wind farms and not just building them. So you might see an expansion area for an existing wind farm, or a project that's very controversial that might be, being debated, but they've already looked at permit locations for the towers. So that can be interesting. All right, I'm going to turn a couple layers off just because of the map density here. And I've got my base map turned off, so I'm going to turn the street map back on. And there's a wind farm here along the coast of Michigan. Let's take a look at some of the infrastructure there. Okay, this is by Ludington. And I know some of you are local planners, so I'm going to add county boundaries. We don't have township boundaries in the tool, but we do have county boundaries. So here's Ludington, and zoom in a bit more. So there's a wind farm that's been built south of Ludington. If I turn off the turbines, I should see a single point that's purple for wind. That's the power plant database from the Energy Infrastructure, let's see, EIA, Energy Infrastructure Administration, part of the Department of Energy. And that will allow me to learn a little bit more about the wind farm as a whole. So it looks like it's about 100 megawatts total, and it's called the Lake Winds Energy Park. Then I've got, if I add the wind turbines again, this will just give you an example. This particular layer is very detailed because these permit locations have to be obviously in the right place. So if you were to zoom in really close and switch to the imagery, I don't know if I've ever seen an exception from this dot being exactly at the foundation of the turbine that you can see on the aerial photography. So this white is the turbine and this is the shadow. You can also see transmission lines and sometimes pipeline rights of way in the imagery. So that's a really useful thing to do when you're at large scales. And then let's zoom back out a little bit. And how does this wind farm connect to the grid? So now I've got the transmission line showing, and I'm going to add substations. So the substations are these red squares, and that might allow me to figure out, where the wind farm connects to the grid, and certainly it'll show me the major transmission lines that are in the county and where they're routed. I can click on those as well and find out what their transmission capacity is, and the company. It's an overhead line, 145. It's in the 345 voltage class, 145 kV lines. Owner is Wolverine Power. So those are the sorts of things that you can do with infrastructure. Unfortunately, as far as pipelines, in the past we've had actually licensed proprietary data for the tool because some of it's so useful and not otherwise available. Unfortunately, there isn't a high quality pipeline layer that we can share in the tool. As a local planner, you might be able to access the National Pipeline Mapping System, which is very detailed pipeline data, external to this tool, but they do have a dynamic map that you can use. And that's an official use only database, so we can't add it to this tool as a public portal.
I just wanted to chime in, Jim, as kind of, for people that are watching this, like, how might you use this information? And to reiterate something that Jim just said. So if you're thinking about making your master plan, one of the things that you often look at is what are your existing conditions? What infrastructure do you already have? And most relevant to renewable energy here is the presence of transmission lines, which Jim's pointed out, and also electrical substations, particularly for large projects, for utility scale projects that are going to go onto the grid. Having that infrastructure already in place makes your community a more viable option, because otherwise the proposer of that wind farm or that solar farm would have to effectively pay to extend the transmission, build a new substation. And so many developers, in choosing between places, are looking for communities or the side of the community that has existing substations, existing transmission lines. And so if you're trying to decide, like, is this something that's viable? That's one tool, and that's something, a very clear map that you can include in your master plan in understanding existing conditions.
Right, and the capacity of the lines and the substations are important too. Typically, a wind farm will generate, a nuclear power plant would require a much higher capacity transmission connection than for example, a wind farm. So not only would the substation need to be in the range that makes sense for connectivity, but it needs to have capacity. So if it's running at full capacity, and it would really need to be upgraded in order for it to accommodate another power plant, that's significant. And I have less experience about that, but I would probably first call the company and explain that you're investigating, the viability of alternative energy in your county or your jurisdiction, and just kind of get a sense of whether the infrastructure is able to accommodate new power plants or whether it would need to be upgraded.
I would just chime in too, and kind of the next thing, Jim, that I hope you show people, existing infrastructure, access to substations and transmission lines are part of the puzzle, but and it's a commonality between wind and solar, but also for each of those, we know that wind resource, solar resources, things that come into play, different landscape characteristics. And so one of the things that really got me, like, my gateway to EZMT was knowing that this was a clear place where I could help a community understand where they have transmission and substations, but then discovered kind of the mapping tools that are available to show the range of different considerations that go into solar and wind development. So I wonder if you can kind of show how that might overlay here.
Yes. Okay, so one of the major capabilities of the tool is a modeling system that is used. So I click the Analyze tool. This is split into two parts right now, reports and models. And we're going to be upgrading the interface, so we're going to split this so that they aren't all grouped into one dialog. But there are these power plant models, and what they do is they take a whole set of siting factors. So I'm going to pick one for solar here. Maybe not concentrating solar. Let's look at PV. So I'm not going to get into how you run all these models and everything. I'm just going to talk about their existence and generally what they are. These are a set of siting factors, all of which are in the modeling library, and often, well, their source data is in the mapping library. So you can look at all this on the map. But one of the things that's key for solar energy is the solar resource. And this layer here, tiled photovoltaic potentials, developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it estimates the amount of power generated per unit area based on a typical power plant. So this would be one where the panels are tilted toward the sun at the ideal angle, but they don't track the sun. Okay, so if they track with the sun's movement, or actually the Earth's rotation, then they would generate a bit more power because they would always be perpendicular to the sun, the incoming rays. In addition, between solar measurements and that assumption, they've looked at typical weather patterns. So Southwest being drier is some of the highest potential in the U.S., but middle latitudes like Michigan definitely do have a viable solar resource. So that's one layer. You need to have that, and then you're not going to be able to build on a steep slope. Certain land covers are going to be more advantageous for siting a solar facility than others. You probably don't want to clear a swath of forest to build a solar installation, for example. You typically want to avoid dense populated areas. And so these are all siting factors. And the model was designed by subject matter experts from 3 national laboratories that I mentioned in the presentation, based on available data and siting factors that would be nationally available and pertinent for solar siting. And as you can see, there's models for a whole spectrum of different power plants, each of which have different siting factors. So one more detail here is on distance to substation. These are substations ranging from 220 to 345 kV. So they're not the largest substations or the smallest. That's about a mid-range one that would be typical of a larger utility scale solar plant. All these things can be manipulated and adjusted by the users. So this is kind of a default configuration, and you can design your own. There's all kinds of ways you can modify this and launch the model. These models take maybe at most 10 minutes to run, usually about 2 minutes. And the results go into the results tool. So I've got a large list, okay? I've been using this tool for a long time. A lot of things have been saved. But for everybody, when you first register, these models have been pre-run. So if you look, this group of system models, this is all populated for everybody. And then I've got a bunch of customized things I've run. So this is very similar to the mapping dialog. You can filter on things. So I'm going to continue, I'm just going to put PV in here. And it's going to give me a whole set of models that have been run for utility scale PV. Okay, so that added an overlay to the map, and it obliterated the other layers. So I'm going to demonstrate that you can drag this down in the table of contents. Now the layers, some layers are drawing over the top of it. And you can also adjust the transparency. So here I'll just put a backdrop. So now this is a range of the model, or a map of the model output over a certain range of suitability, where black is unsuitable and red is highly suitable. And you know, the cell size is 250 meters, so this is a pretty detailed output for this region. And based on all those siting factors, it's showing me where things are likely more suitable for a solar PV plant or less suitable. I'll defer to other webinars and those training videos for more detail on the modeling. But rest assured, there's a lot of capabilities there, and it'll help you get some sense of all these different siting factors that come into play. Before we leave the topic, though, let's take a look at wind. So there's land-based wind. Let me just let's look at 100-meter and offshore. Okay, so there's separate models for offshore wind and land-based wind. But here's that. The offshore wind, one of the factors is the depth of the water, because you know, once you get beyond a certain depth of water, then you've got to, you know, maybe put an anchor and have a floating unit, and of course you need to connect to onshore substation that's within range, so the cost would go up the farther offshore you are. But you know, that's just one of the siting factors offshore. So that's why we have different models between the land-based and the offshore wind turbines. One thing that isn't addressed in the model is visibility and some of the local siting factors, like you know, offsets from roads to reduce the danger of ice throw or the tower collapsing onto the roadway. And there's issues of shadow flicker in some communities that you need to be a certain distance from facilities. Wind turbines generate noise. So there are a lot of factors to consider when you're looking at local siting of wind. This tool doesn't get at those local siting factors. It was designed for energy zones or larger regions. But even so, this will give you a lot of insight into the factors that come into play for siting these types of power plants in a local community.
And the observation, I'll just chime in, that you can make there, right, is that Lake Winds wind farm, in my mind, it validates a little bit the models that are already in EZMT, that the Lake Winds wind farm is in the places with some of those darker shades of red or of orange. So I think that that's really helpful. I think, Jim, maybe it's now or maybe it's later. You know, one of the things that's often brought up on solar in the state, most of our existing renewable energy is wind, and there are vast differences in wind resources across the state. On solar, people say, why are we talking about solar in the state of Michigan? One, because we're not Arizona. But also, if you look at the solar irradiation maps, there's not all that much difference in solar potential in Michigan. So, you know, when you did your suitability analysis for solar, you know, we didn't have too many places that were in the darker shades, but we know based on utility IRPs, this is the plans that the big investor-owned utilities file with the Public Service Commission that kind of plan out where they're going to get their power in the future, that they're considering solar. So from their perspective, it is sunny enough. So how can communities better understand how the solar in their place relates to the solar a couple counties over, or how other factors come into play using this tool?
Yeah, that's excellent. So first of all, let me just let me zoom out to the US and show the solar model. I might have loaded the one that was for the Eastern Interconnection. Let me see here. Yeah, just a second. Shoot. Okay, so here's the model result for the US. So one of the issues is that the solar resource is so high in the Southwest that the middle latitudes don't show a lot of variation for solar within them. So that's kind of what the question pertains to. What we could do is just make, you know, we could say, you know, the solar is pretty uniform for the state of Michigan. We're going to start with the baseline assumption that that's viable and run the model without including the solar resource as a siting factor. So we're just going to look at siting factors for solar that are, you know, in Michigan, the other siting factors. And since we talked about this in advance, we ran this model already. So I'm just going to show you that result. Okay, so nationally, now we have a map of solar viability without considering the solar resource, just the other siting factors that are in the model. And now we're seeing some higher suitability categories in Michigan. Okay, so I'm going to use the back button, and I'm going to get back to the zoom level that I had previously, just to demonstrate that. Okay, so now we're seeing kind of a whole set of suitability in Ludington that's higher. And now, just to go full circle here, how did this get to be red? I mean, what is the basis for that? Well, I can go back to that model and I can look at the actual configuration for it by clicking the gear icon. So if I want to review what went into the model, I can do that. And all of these layers are available to show on the map. So without doing all that, all I have to do is go to the map layers and add these to the map and start examining them. And I can start seeing what's going on behind the scenes to make an area highly viable or not. So another way to do that for certain topics is the reporting tool. So in order to do that, again, it's the analyze window, but now I'm going to talk about the bottom section. And let's take a look at the habitat report. So habitat is one of the siting factors that, you know, will knock out certain areas for being viable. And I can run that for a certain county. So I select the county extent and I pick Michigan. And then I'm going to find Ludington. Let's see here, Ludington. Oh, it's not Ludington County. I don't know the name of the county Ludington is. Okay.
It's Mason County.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I would assume you know the name of your county, so we'll forget that little gap there. So that just launched a habitat report for Mason County. If I go to my results, you know, it's sorted with the most recent things first. So here's Mason County, Michigan, habitat report has completed and has not completed. Okay, sometimes our little queuing thing doesn't always work perfectly. I'm going to show you a prior habitat report just so you know what goes on there. So this was actually for Genesee and Saginaw counties in Michigan, so a little different area. But this is what habitat content looks like. It's got some categories that have been developed that relate to power plant suitability. So it's not just looking at habitat, it's looking at habitat from the standpoint of whether it's consistent with the idea of siting a power plant. And what it does is it looks up any of the habitat layers that are part of that modeling layer for this location. And I picked a poor example, so I'm gonna, let's look at another one of these. This is out in Saginaw Bay offshore. So this habitat report picked up important bird areas and some data from the landscape permeability flow model. It gets a little deep in the weeds, but if you click this link, you can read about that data source. And if you look at this title, you can add it to the map. So all these things are interconnected within the tool. Okay, you might also look at the protected lands report. I'm just looking at some past runs of this. Okay, so this particular analysis area, is a, kind of northern Michigan, and there's another set of layers that contribute to the protected lands category in the model. So one of the largest is the protected areas database. It's a national layer, and here we see that Sleeping Dunes National Lakeshore is within my analysis area. And then from the National Conservation Easement Database, these are all the easements that were found in the analysis area. This was a large area, so the report's pretty lengthy. And there happens to be the North County National Scenic Trail. As you can imagine, if you're trying to site a facility and you're right next to a scenic trail, you're going to have to consider that in your planning. Whether you're an environmentalist or not, all these siting factors will come into play as you consider your project site. So if you think about it, we're kind of coming at this from two ways. The modeling capability basically says, I have a landscape. Why don't you show me what areas of the landscape appear to be most promising for this particular power plant type? And then what the reports do is allow you to say, I'm interested in this location. What can you tell me about it? And there are reports for other topics like power plants and transmission lines and a whole set of things like that. So those are both means of studying. Every single layer that contributes to the modeling or the reports is in the mapping library, and you can overlay it on the map. Click on it to learn more details. Let me just illustrate that. So if we go to the protected areas database, So now we have the overlay of that. So this went into the went into the protected lands modeling layer, and it also is getting picked up in that report. And if I click on one of these features, I can find those details. So this one is Huron-Manistee National Forest, for example. All right.
Thanks, Jim. Two quick things that I want you to show us. So I know, because we had talked before this, that you ran the analysis of, for example, solar without solar resource as one of the factors in it. It was already done so that we can kind of like a cooking show, take out that time. But could you show someone, and for the people who are watching this, I'll have instructions too written out, but could you show us how you went about doing that? Which I think is going back to the initial model and just taking that element out.
Exactly. Yes, so that was using the solar model. So I'm just gonna make it quicker here, solar. So starting with the utility scale solar PV model, click the gear icon. This is our model launcher dialog. What I did was I deleted the tilted photovoltaic potential layer from the model. And then I clicked launch. You know, you can edit the title for yourself or put some notes. But any of these models that you've run, it will store these configurations. You can open the same dialog again and see them again. So it's kind of self-documenting in that way. And I could have made a lot of other changes just by way of getting a little deeper in here. If I click on the gear icon for land cover, these are the suitability factors and the land cover categories that are in, in that system. So in this case, for example, herbaceous land cover is given 100% suitability. Barren land is 100% suitability because it really might not need to be cleared before use. And you can see there's some fairly lower categories for developed areas, very low suitability for water or offshore areas, obviously. But I can change the assumptions here and tweak the model further at that level. I can also change the relative weight. So if I think habitat is underrepresented, I really want habitat to be more dominant in the model. All I have to do is increase the weight for that, and it'll take a higher importance in the model result. I should say that the outputs from the model are not comparable between models, and they're just relative scores. So if you see 80% suitability in one model and 76 in another, you really can't directly compare those. It's highly dependent on all these settings that you give it. And it just shows you the relative suitability based on the assumptions that it was given. So
this is my like how I think people might use this, just so you know how I'm thinking about it when I'm going to communities. A question is often, right, like, well, I'm interested in solar, but I don't want to, but I'm nervous about making it a free-for-all across the entire township. If I'm only going to select a quarter of the township, like which quarter should it be? And so this gives you some indication, given a model that has inputs from technical experts, not necessarily Michigan technical experts, but technical experts elsewhere, of the things that solar developers are often looking for. The reason, again, that Jim went through and deleted kind of the solar potential is that rather than comparing Michigan to the rest of the country, that's the way to like look within Michigan. But you could also, tweak the model if you think that that solar developers in Michigan are looking for something more. And that's something that kind of I'm going to be digging into going forward, but I wouldn't recommend it that way quite yet. The other thing that you can do is if you know that there are particular things that your community is, factors, these different land use factors that you're interested in, this is a tool to allow you to see where those are and kind of how those line up. Jim, the final question before we wrap this up, just so that, I feel like there are so many tools in this that this is just scratching the surface, I know. Maybe we'll have to have you back in the future for kind of an advanced study. But what I like about this tool is that for those local governments that have in-house GIS capabilities, as you mentioned at the very beginning, for any of these layers that are non-proprietary, there's an ability to download the data set so they can manipulate them in ArcGIS or kind of on their own computer. I know that a lot of local governments in Michigan don't necessarily have a GIS expert there, and so what they might be doing is kind of looking at using the tool online to try to figure out, like, okay, we know where the substations are. We have county boundaries, and so we can, we know where our township sits within that county. Or you can even turn on kind of the map, right? One of the map layers below it, so that you can kind of put those things in physical location within your community. Is there a way? This is a question you don't know is coming. Is there a way to like export the view of the map, or is a best option if you wanted to, for example, include that in your land use, in your master plan, the map of existing substations? Is it to like screenshot what you have?
Yeah, we actually had a print tool that was in the system, and it just didn't work very well, and we ended up just turning it off. But right now, a screenshot would be the best way to get information out of the tool. There's really not anything proprietary about it that you need to worry about. We'd appreciate it if you acknowledge the source of the map that you got it from, but that'd be more of a courtesy. Yeah, and the prior tool would export kind of a PDF or a JPEG image, but right now that's not enabled. So yeah, you'd be making screen snapshots to accomplish that.